Whose house is this? Mine, you just said it yourself.
You just said it yourself.
The morning of Jordan's 6th birthday started the way most Saturday mornings in the Coleman house started, with Marcus in the kitchen, making too much noise and not enough coffee. Simone heard him from upstairs, the cabinet doors opening and closing with that particular kind of force that wasn't quite a slam but wanted to be. She had learned, in 7 years of marriage, to read the cabinet doors the way a meteorologist reads pressure systems. This morning's pattern said he had looked at his phone before he got out of bed, and whatever he saw had not pleased him. She already knew what it was. She had seen the text notification light up his screen at 6:47 a.m. while he was still asleep, face turned toward the ceiling, breathing through his mouth the way he did when he'd had more than 2 glasses of Hennessy the night before. She hadn't touched his phone. She didn't need to. The name that had flashed across the screen, V, was the same initial she'd seen in his call log 3 weeks ago, and the week before that, and the week before that. Simone sat on the edge of the bed for a moment after he went downstairs. She looked at the window. Outside, the Atlanta sky was doing what it did in late September, that particular clean blue that made the city look like a promise it had no intention of keeping. The Bradford pear trees in the backyard had just started to turn. She took a breath. Then she got up, washed her face, moisturized in the order her grandmother had taught her: toner, serum, oil, then cream, and went to wake up her son. Jordan Whitfield Coleman was 6 years old as of 7:23 that morning, a fact he announced to his mother the moment she opened his bedroom door. Before she could say a word, "I'm 6, he said. He was already sitting up in bed, hair standing in 4 different directions, the Space Jam comforter pushed to the foot of the mattress. He had Marcus's jaw and Simone's eyes and a gap between his front teeth that their dentist said would close on its own and that Simone privately hoped would not, because she loved it. "You are 6, she said. She sat on the edge of his bed, and he climbed immediately into her lap, all knees and elbows, a full 38 pounds of boy who still wanted to be held and had not yet been told by the world that this was something to be embarrassed about. She held him tighter than was strictly necessary. "Am I getting the cake?" he asked into her shoulder. "You are getting the cake." "The one with the race cars?" "The one with the race cars." "And is Daddy going to be nice today?" Simone was quiet for one beat. Then she kissed the top of his head, pressed her lips into his hair, and breathed him in. That particular smell of child sweet and sleep and something underneath it that she had decided, 6 years ago in the delivery room, was the smell of the one thing in her life she had gotten completely right. "Everybody's going to be nice today," she said. "It's your birthday." The party was scheduled for 2 o'clock. By 11, Simone had already done more than Marcus would do all day. She'd driven to Publix for the extra ice. She'd called the rental company to confirm the bounce house delivery. She'd texted Patricia, Marcus's mother, the parking situation on their street, because Patricia always arrived early and always had opinions about where to put the car, and it was easier to preempt than to manage. She'd triple-checked the birthday cake order at the bakery on Cascade Road: 2 tiers, chocolate fudge, buttercream, race cars around the border, and Happy Birthday Jordan on the top in his favorite color, which was currently orange. Marcus came outside around 11:30 with his coffee, looked at the backyard setup, and said, "You should have moved the tables closer to the fence." Simone looked at the tables. She looked at the fence. She said, "Okay," and moved the tables closer to the fence. He went back inside. She stood in the backyard for a moment, in the September sun, and thought about a phone call she'd made 8 days ago to a lawyer whose name she had gotten from Reg. The lawyer, a woman named Adrienne Foster, who ran a family law practice out of an office in Buckhead that did not advertise, had been crisp, thorough, and kind in the specific way of someone who had heard Simone's situation approximately 200 times before and never let that frequency make her careless. They had talked for an hour. Simone had asked 3 pages of questions she'd written out the night before, while Marcus was at the gym. She had not filed anything yet. She had told herself she wanted one more good day, one more birthday, one more normal afternoon with her son and his friends, running in circles in the backyard, and the cake and the candles and the wish. She picked up the nearest table leg and moved it another 6 inches toward the fence. The bounce house arrived at 12:15. 3 of Jordan's friends from his kindergarten class showed up at 1:30 with their parents, who were the politely friendly kind of people that Simone liked, easy to talk to, genuinely warm with the children, not there to perform. Patricia Coleman arrived at 1:45 in a cream pantsuit that was a quarter step too formal for a backyard birthday party, and exactly right for Patricia, because Patricia had grown up in a house where you dressed for things. "Baby," Patricia said when Simone opened the front door. She hugged her daughter-in-law with genuine warmth, the kind that had confused Simone for years before she understood it. Patricia loved her. Patricia also loved Marcus in the particular way of mothers who had made gods of their sons, and she did not always see the conflict between these two things. Behind Patricia came Marcus's cousin Darnell, 32, wide, perpetually cheerful, the kind of man who arrived at parties and immediately started helping with things without being asked. Simone had always liked Darnell. "Where do you need me?" he said. "The drinks are on the kitchen counter," Simone said. "Ice is in the big cooler by the back door." Say less. He was already moving through the house. Marcus's work friend Calvin and his wife arrived at 2. Two of Simone's colleagues from the nonprofit Keisha and Andre came at 2:15 with a wrapped present that Simone suspected contained a book. Because Keisha and Andre were the kind of people who brought books to a 6-year-old's birthday party and were never wrong to do so. By 2:30, the backyard was full of the particular beautiful noise of a child's birthday party in full effect. Jordan and his friends screaming in the bounce house, the older adults standing in small clusters with plates and cups, somebody's toddler sister walking in determined circles on the grass, Darnell running the grill like he'd been specifically trained for it. Simone moved through all of it. She refilled cups. She cut the veggie tray. She got Jordan a juice box when he tumbled out of the bounce house, sweaty and bright-eyed and demanding hydration. She laughed at the right moments and touched the right arms and made sure Patricia had a comfortable chair in the shade. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. Her father had noticed, when she was young, the way she could read a room and meet everyone in it where they were, the way she could make people feel seen without making a production of it. He had told her once that it was a leadership gift, that it was worth more than people understood, that the world had a long history of undervaluing quiet intelligence in favor of loud performance. She'd been 16 when he said that. She'd filed it away and let it grow. Marcus was in the kitchen for most of the first hour. When he came outside, he was present in the way of someone performing presence, the hand on shoulders, the too loud laugh, the particular energy of a man who needed the room to know he was having a good time. Simone watched him from across the yard and thought, he has been out here 8 minutes and he's already touched his phone twice. The cake arrived on the table at 3:15. Simone had picked it up herself because Marcus had said he would and then hadn't, and she had not argued about it, only gotten in the car and gone. It was exactly what she'd ordered. 2 tiers, chocolate fudge, buttercream frosting in ivory and orange, 4 small die-cast race cars in a ring around the bottom tier, "Happy Birthday Jordan" in orange letters that Jordan, when he saw it, declared to be the best cake in the whole world and probably space. They gathered everyone around the table. Jordan stood in front of the cake with his hands clasped behind his back, the most solemn he had looked all day, taking the business of the candles very seriously. Simone stood to his left. Marcus stood to his right, one hand on Jordan's shoulder, the other holding his phone at his side with the screen angled away from Simone. They sang. The yard filled with it off-key and full-throated, Patricia hitting a note that was technically wrong and completely joyful, Darnell doing a little unnecessary run on the final word, Jordan watching the candles the way only a child who has been told wishes are real watches candles. "Okay, baby," Simone said. "Make your wish." Jordan closed his eyes. He stayed that way for a long moment, so long that Calvin's wife laughed softly, charmed by it. Then he opened his eyes, pulled in a breath that seemed too big for his body, and blew. All 6 candles went out on the first try. The yard cheered. The argument started over nothing, the way the worst arguments always do. Simone was cutting the cake. She'd asked Marcus to do it, and he'd waved her off, saying he was talking to Calvin, so she'd picked up the knife herself. She was doing fine. She had cut cake before. Marcus came up behind her. He'd had at least 2 drinks that Simone had counted, and possibly a third she hadn't. And his voice had that particular quality it got when he was feeling scrutinized and wanted to get ahead of it by going on offense. "You're cutting it wrong," he said. "I'm cutting it into pieces," Simone said. "That's how you cut cake. You're supposed to cut the top tier first, Marcus." "I'm just saying. I have cut 12 cakes in this marriage," she said, quietly enough that the nearest guest couldn't hear. "I know how to cut a cake. I'm not saying you don't know how. I'm saying you're doing it wrong." He took the knife from her hand, not snatching. Not quite, but not asking either, and she let him have it. The way she had let him have things for years, because it was easier, because there were children present, because it was Jordan's birthday. Then his phone buzzed. She saw it happen, saw his jaw shift, saw his eyes cut down and then back up, saw the recalibration he did when the outside world pressed against whatever performance he was currently giving. He put the knife down. He stepped half a step away from the table and pulled the phone from his pocket. He read whatever it said. He put the phone back. He turned to Simone with something on his face that wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder, something that needed an outlet it could justify. "You invite Andre," he said. She looked at him. "Keisha and Andre are my colleagues, Marcus. They're my friends. I know who they are. I'm asking why they're here. It's a birthday party. It's a family birthday party. They brought Jordan a gift, and they've been here for an hour. What is the actual problem?" "The actual problem," Marcus said, his voice dropping in that way that was supposed to convey control, but was actually the sound of control slipping, "is that you always do this. You do things without asking me. You make decisions like this is your house." "It is my house," Simone said. She said it plainly, without heat. A statement of fact. "It's my house too. You know what I mean. I don't actually." He looked at her. Something moved across his face. She had seen it before. That specific configuration when he felt cornered by logic and couldn't find his way around it and decided to stop trying. When he reached for something else. What he reached for was the back of her head. Not hard. She would think about this later, about how it wasn't the force of it that made it what it was. It was the deliberateness, the choice, the specific decision to take the hand that had touched his phone 20 minutes ago, the hand that had read whatever Vanessa had sent him, and use it to push his wife's face into their son's birthday cake. The yard went silent. Jordan's race cars. The orange letters of his name. Simone's face. She came up slowly. Buttercream on her forehead, on her left cheek, in her right eyebrow. A smear of chocolate fudge at her jawline. She straightened. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She looked at Jordan first. He was standing 3 feet away, 6 years old, holding a juice box with both hands, staring at his mother with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and immediately knew she would never forget. It was the expression of a child watching the world reconfigure itself in a way he didn't have language for yet. She would spend years making sure he got the language. "Come here, baby," she said. He came to her immediately. She put her hand on his shoulder right at the base of his neck, where she knew he liked to be touched when he was scared. She said quietly, to no one in particular, "We'll get Jordan cleaned up and open the presents early. Keisha, would you mind helping him?" She looked at Keisha, who was already moving, her face careful and steady in the way of a woman who understood what was being asked of her. Then Simone looked at Marcus. She looked at him for a long moment. She said nothing. She took Jordan inside. In the upstairs bathroom, she washed her face. She ran the water warm the way her grandmother had taught her warm water to open, cool water to close. She used the good cleanser, the one that smelled like eucalyptus, and she worked it into her skin with her fingertips in slow circles. She rinsed. She patted dry with the good hand towel, the one she'd bought at the shop in Little 5 Points because she liked the weight of it. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked for a long time. Then she took her phone from her pocket and she made 2 phone calls. The first one was to a man who answered on the second ring, the way he always did, the way he had answered every phone call from her since she was old enough to have a phone, because she was his youngest, and she had always been the one he worried about most and the one he was proudest of, and he had never found a way to separate those two things. "Daddy," she said. "Reginald Whitfield Sr.," said Simone. His voice was the same voice. It had always been low, unhurried. The voice of a man who had learned decades ago that the people who spoke the loudest in a room usually had the least to say. He waited, she told him. She told him all of it, not in pieces but in full, standing in her bathroom with the towel folded over the edge of the sink and the sound of the party continuing below her, some of the parents keeping it going for Jordan's sake. She told him about the year, the phone calls, Vanessa's initial on the screen, the lawyer, the 8 days, the tables by the fence, the cake. She heard him breathing. "Okay," he said finally. That was all. Just okay. In the 43 years, she had known her father in the precise way that she had known him since she was 6 months old, and he had held her in the hospital and made the specific decision that she would never lack for anything within his power to give. She had learned that when Reginald Whitfield Sr. said okay in that particular register, the conversation was not ending. Something was beginning. "I'm calling Reg," she said. "I know," her father said. "Call him." The second phone call was to her brother, who picked up on the first ring and said, before she could speak, "What did he do?" It wasn't a question. Downstairs, Marcus stood in his backyard. Most of the guests had filtered out politely, efficiently, with the coordinated grace of people who understood they were being given a gift by being allowed to leave. Darnell was still there, in the corner by the grill, his back to the yard, cleaning up. Patricia sat in her chair in the shade. She had not moved. She had not said anything. She was looking at the birthday cake, at what was left of it, the orange letters half collapsed, one race car lying on its side in the wreckage. Calvin and his wife were gone. Keisha and Andre were gone. The children were gone. The bounce house sat in the corner of the yard, deflating slowly, making a sound like a long exhale. Marcus looked at the back door. He thought about going in. He thought about what he would say. He was already building the structure of the explanation, the stress of work, the way she pushed his buttons, he was building it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had built similar structures many times before and knew which pieces fit together, which load-bearing elements to use. Then he saw his mother's face. Patricia was looking at him, not at the cake, at him. He had seen his mother's face his entire life. He knew every version of it: proud, worried, amused, disappointed in the small ways that mothers get disappointed when their sons leave dishes in the sink or forget to call on Sundays. He had never seen this version before. It was quiet, it was old, it was the face of a woman looking at something she didn't recognize. Marcus looked away first. Inside, Simone sat on Jordan's bed while he opened his presents, Keisha and Andre's book, which was about a black boy who wanted to be an astronaut, and was in fact exactly right. A Lego set from the kids in his class, a remote control car from Patricia that Jordan received with audible gratitude. Simone watched her son's hands work through the wrapping paper, precise and focused the way he got when something mattered to him, and she thought about what her father had said in the silence after she told him. Not in words. Her father communicated entire paragraphs in the silence after things. This particular silence had said, "I should have moved faster. I waited because you asked me to wait, and I will not make that mistake again." But it had also said underneath, in the register she'd been reading her whole life, "I am here. I have always been here. I am not going anywhere." Jordan held up the astronaut book. "Mama," he said, "this boy looks like me." "He does," Simone said. "Is that why they picked it?" "Probably," she said. "Some people pick presents like that. They think about what you might want to see." Jordan looked at the cover for a moment. Then he looked at her, with Marcus's jaw and her eyes and the gap in his teeth that she hoped would never close. "Mama," he said. "Yeah, baby. Is your face okay?" She looked at her son. She kept her face steady and open, the way her father kept his face, the way she had learned it from watching him across 100 difficult rooms. "My face is completely fine," she said. "I washed it." Jordan nodded, appearing to accept this as sufficient. "Okay," he said. Then he reached into the pile of tissue paper and pulled out the next present. Simone watched him and loved him with the specific ferocity of a woman who had already made her decision and was, for this moment, simply present in the last ordinary afternoon before everything changed. Outside, she could hear the sound of the bounce house finishing its exhale. Inside, her phone buzzed once in her pocket, confirming what she'd asked. She did not take the phone out. She watched her son open his presents. She had time. The house where Simone grew up, or rather, the house where her father lived in Atlanta, which was different from the house in Birmingham, which was different from the property in Martha's Vineyard, which was different from the apartment in New York that existed for his board meetings, and that her brother Reg used more than anyone, sat on 3.5 acres in Buckhead, behind a gate that was not ornate. This was deliberate. Everything about Reginald Whitfield Sr. was deliberate. The gate was iron, painted black, set into a stone wall that was mostly hidden by old boxwoods that had been there before the wall was built. The driveway was unpaved oyster shell, the kind that crunched under tires in a way that meant you always heard a car coming. The house itself was a 1960s modernist structure, low and horizontal, all glass and weathered cedar, the kind of architecture that looked understated until you noticed the scale of it, until you counted the windows and did the math on the square footage, and even then it was the art inside that told you who lived here, not because it was showy, but because it was chosen with the particular attention of a man who had spent 40 years buying things that he actually loved. Simone had a key. She had always had a key. She pulled in at 7:15 on the Saturday night of Jordan's birthday, with Jordan asleep in his car seat and one bag packed enough for a week, because that was the honest estimate, though she hadn't said that to Jordan. She'd told him they were having a sleepover at Granddad's. Jordan had accepted this with 6-year-old equanimity and fallen asleep before they hit I-285. The house was lit inside warm amber, the way her father kept it in the evenings. She could see his silhouette in the kitchen window as she pulled into the garage. He was making tea. She carried Jordan inside first, both arms, the full 38 pounds of him dead asleep and boneless, and her father held the door without being asked and followed her down the hall to the guest room that had always been Jordan's room when they came, with the books her father kept stocked on the shelf and the nightlight shaped like a crescent moon that had been there since Jordan was 2. She laid him down. Her father pulled the blanket. They stood for a moment on either side of the bed, looking at the boy. Then they went to the kitchen, and her father made her tea. Reginald Whitfield Sr. was 6'1", dark-skinned, and had the physical stillness of a man who had learned early that stillness was a form of power and had practiced it so long it was now simply his nature. He wore at 7:15 on a Saturday evening, pressed slacks and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow because he did not own casual clothes in the way most people understood the term. The most casual he got was this sleeves rolled, shirt untucked, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He set the tea in front of Simone and sat across from her at the kitchen island. The kitchen was the room she had always loved most in this house, not the formal rooms, not the study with the floor-to-ceiling shelves, but the kitchen where her father had cooked for her on Sunday mornings her whole childhood, and where the light came in at a particular angle in the mornings that made everything look like a painting. She wrapped both hands around the mug. Her father looked at her face. "Tell me the rest of it," he said. She had given him the broad outline on the phone. Now she gave him everything, not the summary, not the version she'd been constructing in her head for months, the version that was careful and organized and didn't make her look like a woman who had stayed somewhere she should have left, but the actual account. The first time she'd noticed his phone. The 3 months she'd told herself she was being paranoid. The call log in October of last year that she hadn't been able to explain away. The change in the texture of his attention, the way he looked at her across a room like she was something he'd purchased that hadn't performed as advertised. Her father listened the way he always listened, completely, without interruption, his eyes on her face. "How long have you had the lawyer?" he said when she was done. 8 days. He nodded. "Adrian Foster," Simone said. "Reg gave me her name." "She's good," her father said. Simone looked at him. "You know her?" "I know her work." He picked up his own mug, held it without drinking. She represented a woman in a similar situation 3 years ago. Did well by her. Simone was quiet for a moment. There was a version of this conversation in which she asked her father how he knew this, and why and how long he had known it was going to come to something like this. She had chosen, for now, not to have that version. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "Did you know?" "Before tonight." Her father was quiet for a long moment. Not the guilty quiet of someone caught. The precise quiet of someone deciding how much of the truth to give and in what order. "I didn't know about the woman," he said. "I knew the marriage had problems. Everyone knew the marriage had problems. I knew they were the kind of problems that end marriages," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at her tea. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you didn't ask me to," he said. "Because this was your life and your choice, and I have spent 40 years believing that my children have the right to make their own choices and suffer their own consequences, within limits. And now he said the limits have been reached." Reggie Whitfield Jr. Reg, to everyone who knew him, which was not as many people as he gave the impression of knowing, was 39 years old and ran Whitfield Private Equity out of a suite of offices in Midtown Atlanta that were designed to look like a law firm and functioned like a war room. He was, of all the Whitfields, the one who looked most like their father, same height, same stillness, same quality of attention that made people in meetings feel like they were being taken apart and reassembled for later reference. He was also the one who had liked Marcus Coleman the least from the beginning, and had said so once, 4 years ago, in the kitchen of this same house, when their father had given him a look that ended the conversation. He had not said it again. He had instead opened a file. He called Simone at 8:30 while she was sitting in her father's study. "I'm at the office," he said, "on a Saturday night. I was here anyway." He paused. "How's Jordan?" "Asleep." "He's fine." "Good." Another pause. "Simone, I know, I have some things I need to show you." "Not tonight? Tomorrow? How bad?" He was quiet. "Reg, come in at 10, he said. "Bring coffee. The folder is going to take a while." Marcus called 9 times that night. Simone watched the screen each time, name lighting up, and let it ring through. The 10th time he called, at 11:42, she sent it to voicemail and then listened to the voicemail, because she needed to know what version he had landed on. The voicemail was 4 minutes and 12 seconds long. She listened to the whole thing. He had landed on the stress version. Work had been brutal. The pressure had gotten to him. He didn't know why he did it. That wasn't him. She knew that wasn't him. He loved her. He loved Jordan. He needed her to come home so they could talk. They could work this out. They had built something together, and he was not going to let that fall apart over one terrible moment that he already regretted more than she knew. He did not mention Vanessa. He did not mention the phone. Simone sat with the phone in her hand after the message ended. She thought about the 4 minutes and 12 seconds of it, how much of it she had believed. 6 months ago. A year ago. How much of it she might still believe in a different life, if the thing the message was working so hard not to mention did not exist. She thought about Jordan's face at the birthday table. She put the phone down and went to bed. She had not been back to sleep in this room since Christmas, and the room itself the one her father had always kept as hers, even after she left for Spelman, even after she got her own apartment in law school, even after the marriage was so precisely unchanged that it sat around her the way certainty sits. The same navy duvet, the same reading lamp on the nightstand, the same stack of books her father had left there since her last visit in December. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and let herself, for the first time all day, be in her own history. She had not told Marcus when they met that her last name was Whitfield. She had been 30 years old, working at the nonprofit, which was a job she had chosen because it was the work she actually wanted to do, housing advocacy, because she had grown up watching her father use capital to build and protect, and she wanted to know what it looked like to do that at the level of a family trying not to lose an apartment. She had been Simone Coleman then. Socially, she'd started using her mother's maiden name in her late 20s, because her mother had died when Simone was 11, and it was the way she kept her close. The Whitfield name was not a secret. It was simply not something she led with. She didn't lead with her father either. She was not ashamed of him. She was the opposite of ashamed. She had spent her life watching him build something extraordinary, and she carried that pride like a stone in her chest, but she had grown up watching what the name did to rooms, and she had wanted, for once in her adult life, to be in a room where it wasn't doing anything. Marcus had asked her on their third date about her family. "My mother passed when I was young," she'd said. "My father is in business. My brother Reg works with him. We're close." That had been true. Every word of it had been true. He hadn't pressed. She had thought at the time that this was because he was respectful of her pace. She understood now that it was because he was not, in fact, particularly interested in her family history. He was interested in the version of Simone that existed in relation to him, the way she made him feel, the way she moved through the world in a way that he found reassuring and complimentary to his own sense of himself. He had not asked again until they were engaged, and by then she had been planning to tell him. She had been building to it, finding the right moment, asking her father and Reg to give her time. Her father had said, "Your life, your choice, your timing." Reg had said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. And then the engagement had moved fast, the way Marcus moved when he wanted something, and the wedding had come together, and she had told herself she would tell him after. After was easier. After was when they were settled. After had never arrived. She had looked across 7 years of marriage and seen the accumulation of specific decisions her husband had made about who she was, and each one had confirmed quietly that the number she'd been waiting to hit had not changed. She turned onto her side. Outside the window, the Buckhead night was quiet in the way of streets with long driveways and old trees. She closed her eyes. She thought about her grandmother, Dorothy Whitfield Meemaw. To her grandchildren, a name she had accepted with private amusement because she had not expected to become a Meemaw and had not entirely wanted to, and had loved becoming one more than she had loved. Most Things was 91 years old and lived in the house in Birmingham where she had raised 3 children and built, with her late husband Edwin, the first Whitfield funeral home on 4th Avenue North in 1959. The funeral home no longer existed in that form. It existed in the form of everything Reginald had built from it, but the house was still there, and Dorothy was still in it, and she had turned down every offer her son had ever made to move her somewhere more convenient or more comfortable, because she understood, in the way of women who had been building things since before their children were born, that the house was not a place she lived. It was the place the family came back to, and if she left, there would be no coming back to. She called Simone at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning, not because she'd been told what happened. She had not yet been told. Dorothy Whitfield called on Sundays because she called on Sundays, and because she had a gift or possibly a surveillance apparatus. The family had debated this for decades for knowing when someone needed to be called. "Morning, baby," she said. "Morning, Meemaw." A pause. "You're not at home." It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am," Simone said. "You're at your daddy's." "Yes, ma'am." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. In the background, Simone could hear the sounds of Dorothy's Sunday morning, the television on low, church somewhere nearby, the specific creak of the chair on Dorothy's back porch. "You know what your grandfather used to say?" Dorothy said. "Which thing?" "He said there's 2 kinds of leaving. There's leaving because you're running, and there's leaving because you've already arrived somewhere and you finally know it." She paused. "He said most people don't know the difference until they're already gone." Simone was quiet. "I've been thinking you knew the difference for a while now," Dorothy said. "Meemaw." "I'm not asking," the old woman said, with the particular firmness of someone who had long since moved past the need to be told things in order to know them. "I'm just saying, when you get ready to come home, come to Birmingham. I mean, Come see me, I'll be here. I'll make the biscuits. Okay, Simone said. Her voice had gone soft in the way it only went when she talked to Dorothy. And Simone, yes, ma'am. Don't let them make this smaller than it is, Dorothy said. Whatever it is. Don't let anybody put it in a little box and hand it back to you as something you should get over. You hear me? I hear you. Good. A pause. How's that baby of mine? He's eating your son's eggs right now. He found the cheese. Dorothy made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a verdict. Good boy, she said. Knows where the good stuff is. At 10 a.m., Simone sat across from her brother in the conference room of Whitfield Private Equity, with a coffee in her hand and a file folder in front of her that she had not yet opened. Reg sat across from her. He was wearing the same thing he wore every day, dark suit, white shirt, no tie, and he had the look he got when he was about to tell someone something they already half knew and still wouldn't enjoy hearing. How bad, she said again. He opened the folder in front of him. The girlfriend's name is Vanessa Price, he said. She's 32. She got her MBA from Kellogg. She's been at Caldwell Group for 4 years. She's their director of acquisitions. Simone's hand went still around her coffee cup. Caldwell, she said. Reg nodded. Harold Caldwell's Caldwell Group. Yes. The room was quiet for a moment. Simone looked at the folder in front of her, at the name on the tab Price V, and thought about the shape of what she was looking at, the architecture of it, whether it was what it appeared to be or something more deliberate, and she felt the cold, specific feeling of a woman realizing she has not been in a situation but in a design. How long has she been seeing Marcus, she said. We have documentation going back 14 months, Reg said. It may be longer. And Caldwell Group has been making acquisition inquiries toward Whitfield Holdings for 22 years, Reg said. He said it flatly, in the voice of someone reading a weather report. Their most recent approach was 18 months ago. Dad declined, as he has every previous approach. 14 months ago, Vanessa Price began a relationship with your husband. The silence in the room had a particular quality to it. You think Harold Caldwell sent her, Simone said. I think, Reg said carefully, that a woman with Vanessa Price's resume who ends up in a relationship with a man married to a Whitfield, 14 months after her employer was rebuffed in an acquisition attempt, is either the most extraordinary coincidence in Atlanta business history, or it is not a coincidence. What does Marcus know? That's the part I think you need to understand, Reg said. He leaned forward slightly. My read, and I want to be clear, this is my read, I don't have direct evidence of his intent, is that Marcus doesn't know who she is in this context. I think he thinks she's just a woman he met. I think she has been very careful to keep it that way. So he's being used, Reg said, which does not make what he did yesterday any less of what it was. But it does change the picture. Simone sat back. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, the clean white ceiling of her brother's conference room, a room where serious things were decided, a room she had sat in many times as a daughter of this family, never quite as a principal. What did she want from him? Simone said. Reg picked up the first document in the folder. That, he said, is what we're going to figure out. The Caldwell Group occupied the top 2 floors of a building on Peachtree Street in Buckhead, and Harold Caldwell had made sure, when he signed the lease in 1998, that his office had a view of the Whitfield Holdings building 3 blocks north. This was not sentiment. Harold Caldwell did not do sentiment. It was a practice. He had read once, in a biography of a man he admired, that it was useful to keep the thing you wanted in your line of sight. Not as motivation was for people who needed reminding of what they wanted. As discipline. As the ongoing acknowledgement that wanting something was not the same as having it, and that the distance between those two things demanded daily attention. He had looked at the Whitfield Holdings building from his office chair for 27 years. He was still looking. Reg's documentation was thorough in the way of a man who had been building a file for some time. He walked Simone through it over the course of 3 hours, with coffee and then lunch brought in from the place downstairs, the kind of working lunch that happened in this building all the time, orderly and unhurried, and what emerged was a picture that Simone kept having to adjust her eyes to receive, the way you adjust to a room after someone turns the lights all the way up. Vanessa Price had grown up in Charlotte, father a dentist, mother a high school principal. She'd done undergrad at UNC Chapel Hill, worked 2 years in banking in New York, gotten her MBA from Kellogg, and joined Caldwell Group's acquisitions team at 28, unusually senior entry for someone her age. The Caldwell Group recruiters had flown to Evanston for her. She had not applied. They went looking for her specifically, Simone said. Or for someone like her, Reg said. Smart, polished black, well-networked in the right circles. The kind of person who could move comfortably in environments that Harold Caldwell at 71 cannot access without signaling himself. Environments like what? Reg looked looked at her. Like the nonprofit sector, Simone said. Like the nonprofit sector, he confirmed. Like HBCU alumni networks, like the specific social world you and Marcus moved in. Simone was quiet for a moment. She got close to him at a Spelman alumni event, she said. She had not known this until this morning, but she had been assembling it as they talked, fitting pieces together the way she had always been able to do her father's gift for pattern, her mother's gift for people, combined into something that sometimes frightened her with its precision. He wasn't a Spelman alum. He was a guest, Riggs said. Calvin's wife is a Spelman alum. She would have had him on her +1. And Vanessa was working the room. Simone looked at the photo in the folder, a professional headshot, LinkedIn or company website, standard corporate portrait. Vanessa Price was a beautiful woman in the precise way of someone who had thought carefully about how to present beauty in a professional context. Warm smile, eyes that were doing a controlled version of open. She looked like someone you would trust immediately, which Simone understood was the point. What does Caldwell Group think Marcus gives them? Simone said. Reg turned to a section of the folder, 3 pages stapled together. Their original theory, as best as I can reconstruct it, was that Marcus had genuine proximity to the Whitfield family through you, that through him, Vanessa might get intelligence on our holdings, our liquidity position, whether Dad was considering any transitions, the kind of inside information that would tell them when and how to make a move. But he doesn't have that. He doesn't know anything. No, Reg said, he doesn't. Because you never told him. He said this without emphasis, without editorial. A fact. Simone thought about it. She thought about every dinner party, every family event Marcus had not been invited to, every phone call she had taken in another room. She had never been strategic about it. She had simply been private, the way she had always been private, the way you became private when you grew up in a family where information was a form of asset. She had not told Marcus the true scale of what her father had built because she had not wanted to be looked at the way she would have been looked at, and she had not wanted Marcus to be looked at the way he would have been looked at, and she had been trying, for 7 years, to simply be a woman in a marriage without the rest of it. So Vanessa's been operating on bad intelligence, Simone said. For over a year, Reg said. She's been maintaining a relationship with a man who cannot give her what her employer needs, without apparently knowing that. How do you think she'd react, Simone said slowly, if she found out who I actually am? Reg looked at her. I'm asking, Simone said. She'd panic, Reg said. And when she panicked, she'd tell Caldwell. And when she told Caldwell, he'd have to decide whether to cut her loose or change strategy.
Yes.
And if he changed strategy, he'd make a move directly.
On us, without the cover.
Simone sat back. She turned her coffee cup slowly. So our best position, she said, is to be the ones who decide when he finds out. Reg looked at his sister for a moment with the expression he got when she did something that reminded him of their father, not surprise exactly, more like the satisfaction of a confirmed hypothesis. Yes, he said. That's our best position. Marcus showed up at Simone's nonprofit office on Monday morning. She was in a meeting when her assistant Brenda came to the door of the conference room with the look of someone who had been asked to do something she was uncertain about and had decided the uncertainty was the right call. Your husband is in the lobby, Brenda said. Simone did not look up from the document she was reviewing. Tell him I'm in a meeting. He said he'll wait. He can wait. She turned the document over. Can you also let Marcus know when you have a moment that he should call Adrian Foster's office today? Her number is on the card in the main drawer of my desk. She looked at Brenda. He'll know what it means. Brenda looked at her for one beat. Okay, Brenda said, and went back to deliver 2 different messages, one of which she had been asked to deliver and one of which she had been asked to witness the delivery of. Marcus waited 45 minutes. Then he left. He did not call Adrian Foster. The call Simone had been expecting from Reg came on Tuesday morning. He went to her place last night, Reg said. Our guy had eyes on it, I figured. He stayed 3 hours. I figured that too. Reg was quiet for a moment. He's not doing what someone does when they're choosing, he said. He's doing what someone does when they're panicking and running to the nearest familiar thing. I know. Simone was walking through Piedmont Park in the early morning before anyone else on her team was in the office. The air had that particular October quality, cool enough to feel like a decision, warm enough to be pleasant. He doesn't know what he's in the middle of. No. And Vanessa appears to be proceeding normally. Still at the office. We had a contact reach out business context, nothing that would flag, and she performed exactly as expected. Professional, warm, no indication that she knows anything is different. Good. Simone walked. When do we want to move? That's the question, Reg said. Dad wants to know your timeline on the divorce filing. Adrian says end of week if I want to proceed. Do you? Yes. she said. I've been decided for months, Reg. The question was never whether. It was when. Okay. A pause. And the other thing, the Caldwell thread. That's a different timeline. I know. She stopped at the edge of the lake. The morning light was on the water, and two runners were passing behind her, and the city was making its Tuesday sounds. I need a few more weeks on that. I need to look at something first. What? I need to look at their debt structure, she said. Caldwell Group. I want to know what their current obligations look like and where they're exposed. Reg was quiet for a moment. Simone, he said. I'm not asking Dad to do anything, she said. I'm asking you to pull the numbers. Just the numbers for now. I want to see the shape of it. Another pause. I'll have something by Thursday, he said. She met with her father on Wednesday evening after Jordan was in bed. They sat in the study, the way they always sat when they had things to work through. Her father in the chair on the left side of the fireplace, Simone on the couch opposite, the low lamp on, the city outside the long windows. This room had been the site of more conversations that mattered to her than any other room in her life. She had told her father, in this room, when she decided to go to Spelman instead of Georgetown, the choice that had surprised everyone except him. She had told him in this room when she passed the bar. She had told him in this room 8 years ago that she had met a man named Marcus Coleman and that she liked him very much and that she wanted to see where it went. He had listened then the way he listened now, completely, without performance, with the full weight of his attention. You want to tell me about the Caldwell debt structure, he said, when she had finished laying out what she'd asked Reg to pull. It's connected, she said, to all of it. Walk me through. She did. She took him from Vanessa's recruitment, through the 14 months, through the acquisition timeline, through the logic of what Caldwell was trying to do, and what he had failed to understand about Marcus's actual proximity to the Whitfield family. Her father listened. He occasionally asked a question, precise, minimal, the kind of question that was designed to make her think, not to lead her anywhere. When she was done, he said, and if their debt structure is what you think it is, then they're exposed, she said, significantly. And if someone were to acquire that debt, they would have significant leverage.
Yes.
Leverage over Harold Caldwell.
Yes.
Her father looked at her for a long moment. His face was the face she had been reading her whole life, composed, calibrated, operating at a depth that most people never saw, because most people didn't know to look for it. You know that if you do this, he said, it won't stay quiet. Harold will know who moved against him. I know. And you're all right with that. I am all right, she said carefully, with Harold Caldwell knowing exactly who he was dealing with when he decided to run an operation against my marriage. Her father was quiet. Daddy, she said. I'm not objecting, he said. I'm listening. Then say what you're thinking. He looked at her across the fireplace. In the lamplight, she could see the things she sometimes saw in his face, the long history of him, the 68 years of building something from nothing and protecting it, and teaching his children to protect it, and the specific cost of all of it, the price of being a black man in America with something worth taking, and the permanent vigilance that required. I'm thinking, he said, that your grandfather built that funeral home because in Birmingham in 1959, the only black-owned businesses that white banks would loan to were businesses that served a need nobody else wanted to serve. He built it with that money, and then he built everything else. He paused. I'm thinking Harold Caldwell has been trying to take what your grandfather built for 27 years. I'm thinking he found a way to come at it through my daughter's marriage. The fire made a small sound. And I'm thinking, he said, that you were never the woman Harold Caldwell thought he was up against. Simone looked at her father. No, she said. I wasn't. Thursday's numbers came in from Reg at 7 a.m. with a one-line note, call me when you've read them. She read them in her father's kitchen with Jordan eating cereal at the counter, and she read them twice, and then she sat very still for a moment and thought about what they meant. Caldwell Group's debt obligations were larger than she had expected, significantly larger, concentrated in 3 specific facilities that had been extended and re-extended over the past 4 years, serviced comfortably when commercial real estate lending was favorable, and now sitting in a position that had quietly become precarious. The covenant structures had been loosened in each extension. There was, if you knew where to look, a window, not a large one, but large enough for a vehicle with the right capital and the right timing. She called Reg. I see it, she said. I know you see it, he said. Question is what you want to do with it. I want to talk to Adrian today, she said. And I want you to set up time with the team this week, the investment team, not legal. I want this structured properly, Simone, Reg said. This is not a small move. I know. Dad would do this with one phone call. You don't have to. I know he would, she said. I'm asking you to help me do it myself. The silence on Reg's end was approximately 4 seconds. Okay, he said, I'll set up the time. Marcus came to the house on Thursday afternoon. Their house, his house. Technically, in the sense that his name was on the mortgage, though Simone had made the down payment from an account he had never asked about, assuming it was savings, not knowing it was one of 3 accounts that existed under her name in a structure her father had set up when she turned 21. She had been meaning for years to tell him. She had not told him. He sat in the kitchen, the kitchen with the blue tile she had picked out and the pendant lights she had installed herself, the kitchen where Jordan had learned to walk by pulling himself up on the cabinet handles. And he looked like a man who had slept very little and thought very much and arrived somewhere he wasn't certain about. He had brought flowers. Peonies, which were her favorite, which told her he still knew that, and she accepted that it was both true and insufficient and moved on. I need you to come home, he said. Simone sat across from him at the island. She had a glass of water. She did not offer him anything, Marcus. I know what I did was wrong. I know it. He said it with the particular texture of a man who had practiced this but was also, underneath the practice, genuinely distressed. She had known Marcus Coleman for 9 years. She knew when he was performing, and she knew when he was real, and right now there was a layer of real underneath the performance that she could see clearly and that did not change anything. I need you to hear something, she said. I'm listening. I'm not coming back, she said. Not because of what happened at the party specifically. What happened at the party was it was the end. But it was the end of something that was already over. She looked at him. I have been a long way from this marriage for a long time. He was quiet. I'm not angry at you, she said. That's what I want you to understand. I don't have the energy for it anymore. I just need us to be honest with each other about what this is. You want a divorce, he said. I'm filing at the end of this week, she said. Adrian Foster. Reg gave me her name. She's good, and she's fair, and I am asking you, genuinely, to get a lawyer and engage with this process in good faith. For Jordan's sake. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Who's Adrian Foster, he said. A family law attorney. Reg, your brother Reg. Yes, something shifted in his face. I didn't know he stopped. I didn't know you talked to your brother about us. We have a relationship, she said. I have a family, Marcus. You never asked very much about them. He was quiet. I know about Vanessa, she said. He went very still. I'm not bringing it up to hurt you, she said. I'm bringing it up because I need you to understand that I have all the information. There's nothing you could show me or tell me that I don't already know, and I'm not asking for an explanation. I'm asking you to sign the papers when they're ready and to be a good father to our son. The kitchen was very quiet. Marcus Coleman, for the first time in the 9 years Simone had known him, looked genuinely small. Not humbled, he was not yet humbled. That would come later. It would come in a specific way he could not yet imagine. But small. The specific smallness of a man who realizes he has been operating without the information he needed, and that the deficit is larger than he estimated. Who are you, he said. It came out low, genuinely uncertain. Not hostile. Something closer to awe, or its darker cousin. Simone stood. I'm going to get Jordan from my dad's house, she said. He'd like to see you this weekend if you want to come by. I'll give you the address. She picked up her keys. We'll talk about the rest of it through Adrian. She walked to the door. Simone, he said. She stopped, her hand on the frame. I'm sorry, he said. For all of it. I'm sorry. She turned and looked at him across the kitchen they had shared for 6 years. He was sitting in the chair where Jordan had learned to eat at a table. The peonies were on the counter in their plastic wrap, still uncut. I know, she said, and then she left. The invitation arrived in Marcus's email at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Jordan's birthday and 2 weeks after Simone had handed him the divorce papers through Adrian Foster's office. It came from an assistant he didn't recognize, at an address he didn't recognize, on behalf of a meeting described only as a conversation regarding shared interests in the Atlanta commercial real estate market. The location was listed as a building on West Peachtree that he'd driven past 100 times, a mid-rise, glass and steel, the kind of building that housed financial services and private equity, the particular businesses that did not need signage. Under other circumstances, Marcus Coleman would have deleted this email. Cold outreach from unnamed parties was the kind of thing he dealt with twice a month, usually from people trying to get his firm's business or pitch him on something. He had a reflex for it. But the previous 2 weeks had reconfigured his reflexes. He had spent those weeks in a state that he didn't have a name for, not quite grief, not quite fear, though it had elements of both. He had gone to work. He had done his job. He had spoken to Vanessa twice, and both times the conversations had been subtly different than before. She had been attentive in a way that felt like monitoring, and he had found himself, After the second call, sitting in his car in the parking garage of his building, wondering what exactly she was monitoring for. He had not been able to name it. He knew something was wrong. He did not know what. He called his cousin Darnell that night not to explain, because he didn't have the shape of it to explain, but to talk, the way men sometimes talk around the thing they mean. I got this meeting request, he said. Yeah? It's weird. Doesn't say who it's from, just some assistant. What kind of meeting? Commercial real estate. Just, he stopped. I don't know why I'm bringing this up. What's your gut? Darnell said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. My gut says I should find out who it's from before I decide, he said. So find out. He had asked his assistant to trace it the next morning. She had come back to him in 40 minutes with a name, Whitfield Private Equity. He had sat with that for a long time. He told Calvin about it over lunch. Calvin was his oldest friend in Atlanta. They had known each other since they were both junior analysts at the same firm 12 years ago, before Marcus had moved up and Calvin had moved sideways, and they had found a way to remain friends across the distance that produces. Whitfield, Calvin said. He put down his fork. As in Simone's people? I don't know, Marcus said. He stopped. She never really told me much about her family. Her dad is in business. Her brother Reg is in business with him. I met Reg once at Christmas, maybe 2 years ago. What does the company do? Private equity, Marcus said. Calvin was quiet for a moment. He was looking at Marcus with the expression of a friend who was doing math. Marcus, Calvin said slowly. What is Reg's last name? Marcus looked at him. Whitfield. Right. Calvin looked at him, and Simone's maiden name is... Marcus opened his mouth. He closed it. He thought about the name he had seen on the divorce papers, in the section listing the petitioner's full legal name, Simone Whitfield Coleman. He had read that and thought because he had been under stress, because his head was somewhere else, because the name had been there in front of him the whole time, and he had simply never assembled it, he had thought, Whitfield. And he had thought, that's her family name. I knew that. He had not thought Whitfield, as in Whitfield Private Equity, as in the building on West Peachtree. Calvin was watching him. Whitfield Private Equity, Marcus said. Calvin said. That's one of the bigger private equity firms in the South. Yeah, Calvin said. Simone's brother runs Whitfield Private Equity. Calvin picked up his fork. He put it down again. You didn't know, Calvin said. It was not a question. Marcus was looking at the table. I didn't know, he said. Calvin said nothing for a moment. Then, carefully, Marcus, do you know who Simone's father is? Marcus looked up. Calvin held his gaze. He drove to the building on West Peachtree the next morning. Not for the meeting was scheduled for Friday. He drove there because he needed to see it, to stand on the sidewalk in front of it, and look up and make the thing real, in the way that only physical presence makes things real. It was a 14-story building. The lobby, visible through the glass, was the kind of lobby that said, everything inside here is worth more than you. Marble. Clean lines. A security desk that looked like a financial services security desk looks professional, understated, and absolutely certain that you will be verified before you proceed. On the directory beside the front door, Whitfield Private Equity, 9th and 10th floors. Whitfield Holding Seek, 11th, 14th floors. Marcus stood on the sidewalk. He thought about Simone's car. The 2019 Accord she drove, which he had always thought of as practical, sensible, a little too modest for the neighborhood they lived in. Not that he'd ever said this. He thought about the down payment on the house, the conversation they'd had, how she had said she had savings, how he had assumed the savings were from her salary and had not pressed for specifics. He thought about 7 years of birthday dinners with her father that had never happened, family visits that had always been to one property or another where Simone was simply at home in a way he had never fully examined. He thought about the nonprofit where Simone worked. He had always known she could make more money elsewhere. She had a Howard Law degree. She had real estate transactional experience. She could have been at any firm in the city. He had thought, she's idealistic. He had thought she does this because she wants to help people. He had not thought she does this because she doesn't need the money, and the money has never been the point. He thought about her face over the birthday cake. He thought about the way she had stood up and washed her face and made 2 phone calls. He stood on the sidewalk for a long time. He called Vanessa that afternoon. He was sitting in his car in the garage beneath his office building. He needed to hear her voice. He needed to talk to someone about what he was thinking, and he did not have a way to have this conversation with anyone in his life who would not judge him or pity him or do both simultaneously while pretending to do neither. Hey, Vanessa said. She picked up on the first ring. Hey. He leaned back. I need to talk through something. Of course. Her voice had that quality, warm, steady, The specific warmth of someone who was good at receiving things. He had always found it reassuring. Now he was trying to locate whether it was real or whether it was a technique. Do you know who Simone's family is? He said. Like, who they actually are. A pause. I know she has family in Atlanta, Vanessa said. And Birmingham, I think you mentioned? Her father's name is Reginald Whitfield. Her brother is Reginald Whitfield Jr. He runs Whitfield Private Equity. The pause this time was different. Marcus was not the kind of man who cataloged pauses with precision he had never needed to, but he was sharp enough to recognize that this pause was a different category than the one before it. This was not the pause of someone receiving new information. This was something else. That's I didn't know, Vanessa said. You work in private equity, he said. You work in acquisitions. In Atlanta. Marcus, there are a lot of private equity firms in Atlanta. You didn't know the name Whitfield Holdings. I know the name, she said. I didn't know Simone was connected to it. He was quiet. He was listening to his gut, which had been trying to tell him something for 3 weeks, and which he had been calling anxiety and attributing to the divorce, and declining to examine more carefully. Where did we meet? He said. Marcus, tell me where we met. At an event, she said. You know where we met. The Spelman alumni event, he said. You were there. People go to all kinds of events. I was there with a friend. Which friend? Another pause. Different again. Marcus, I don't understand what you're... I got a meeting request, he said. From Whitfield Private Equity. For Friday. The line was quiet. Are you going? She said, and there it was. Not, what do they want? Not, why would they reach out to you? Are you going? The question of someone who already understood the landscape of what this meant and needed to know which direction he was moving in it. Marcus Coleman was not, it should be said, a stupid man. He had spent 7 years being careless with a level of intelligence that was real, being incurious about things he should have been curious about, being so invested in the version of himself he'd constructed that he hadn't left room for the reality of the people around him. These were not the behaviors of a stupid man. They were the behaviors of a man who had been comfortable. He was not comfortable now. Yeah, he said. I'm going. He told his mother on Thursday night. He drove to his mother's house in Decatur, the house he had grown up in, a 3-bedroom ranch on a street of 3-bedroom ranches, the house his mother had paid off 12 years ago on a school administrator's salary, and that she kept with a care that made it look like a decision and not just a house. Patricia Coleman's garden was legendary on the street. It had been legendary when Marcus was growing up, and it was legendary now, even in October, even with most things gone to seed for the season. She was in the kitchen when he let himself in with the key she'd given him 20 years ago, and that he had never considered giving back. I'm making soup, she said without turning around. I'm not hungry, he said. She turned around. She looked at him in the way mothers look at sons they have known for 37 years and can read in approximately 3 seconds. Sit down, she said. He sat. She made him soup anyway, chicken and rice, the one she had made him his entire childhood when things were wrong, and it occurred to him that she had made this soup more times in the past 20 years than he had ever counted or thanked her for properly. And she put it in front of him and sat across the table. He told her. He told her about the building, about the directory, about Calvin's face at lunch. He told her about the conversation with Vanessa and the pause that had lived in his chest for 2 days since. His mother listened. She had a cup of tea. She did not drink it. She looked at him while he talked with the face she'd had since Jordan's birthday, that unfamiliar face, the old one that he still didn't know what to do with. Marcus, she said when he was finished. I know. You didn't know who you married. I know. 7 years, she said. You were with that woman for 9 years and you never... She stopped. She put both hands flat on the table. You never asked her who she was. She didn't tell me... She didn't tell you, Patricia said, because you never asked. She said it without anger. She said it the way she had always said hard things to him, with the specific directness of a woman who loved her son precisely enough to refuse to protect him from the truth. Baby, I have been to that woman's house. I have sat at her table. I have watched her move through that life she was living with you, and I didn't know either, but I'm not her husband. You were supposed to know her. Marcus looked at his soup. She invited me to Thanksgiving, Patricia said. That first year. Her father's house. You said you wanted to go to your buddy Calvin's. Marcus went still. I didn't push, Patricia said, because you're my son and you were happy and I didn't want to make trouble. But I thought about it. She was quiet for a moment. She wanted you to know her family, Marcus. She was trying. And you, I know, he said. You have to go to that meeting Friday, she said. I know. And whatever they say to you. She looked at whatever they show you, whatever they tell you, you take it. You hear me? You take it and you don't make it smaller than it is, and you don't make yourself the victim of it. Because you are not the victim of this situation. Marcus looked at his mother's face across the kitchen table. He thought about Jordan's face at the birthday table. He thought about the 2 seconds between the moment it happened and the moment Simone lifted her head, those 2 seconds in which he had registered, somewhere below the level of his decision, that he had done something that could not be undone. He had been right about that. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. She got up and poured more soup into his bowl without asking. Friday morning, Marcus wore the best suit he owned, the charcoal gray one, the one he wore to closings, to presentations that mattered. He told himself this was because the meeting was professional and he should look professional. He was lying to himself and he knew it. He wore it because he needed the armor of it. He arrived at the building on West Peachtree at 9:52 for a 10 a.m. meeting. The security desk gave him a badge without discussion. They had been expecting him, which meant someone had coordinated his arrival, which meant someone had been tracking his RSVP with enough attention to brief the lobby. He rode the elevator to the 10th floor. The receptionist on the 10th floor was a young woman who said, "Good morning, Mr. Coleman," and offered him coffee and water with the practiced warmth of someone who operated in an environment where that level of professionalism was the floor. He accepted the water. He sat in the waiting area and looked around. The space was the kind of space that communicated things through what it chose not to do. No branded merchandise on the walls, no frame deal announcements. A few pieces of art, 2 paintings, and a photograph that Marcus recognized as the kind of thing people who actually knew art acquired, not the kind of thing that came pre-selected by an interior designer. One of the paintings was an abstract, deep blue, the kind Marcus had seen in galleries but never known how to look at. The photograph was a black and white image of a city block, Birmingham. He thought, from the style of the buildings, the 1950s or 60s. He was looking at the photograph when Reg walked into the waiting area. Marcus had met Reg exactly once. Christmas 2 years ago. Briefly, they had shaken hands at a gathering that Marcus had understood to be a family dinner, without understanding that the house was a different house, and the family was a different family than the one he had mapped in his head. He had found Reg difficult to read and had attributed this to Reg being an introvert or a private person. He understood now that Reg had simply had no reason to show Marcus anything. Reg was wearing a dark suit and looked exactly as Marcus remembered, still, measured, the kind of man who occupied space without announcing himself in it. "Marcus," he said. "Reg," Marcus said. He stood, they shook hands. Reg held the handshake for 1 beat longer than was strictly necessary. Not aggressive, just present. "Come on back," he said. The conference room was on the corner, 2 glass walls overlooking Peachtree Street. The city spread out in the October morning light. There was a table that seated 12. There were 3 people already seated. Marcus recognized Simone's father immediately, from the one time he had met him, also at Christmas, also briefly. He looked exactly as Marcus remembered, tall, dark-skinned, a physical stillness that filled the room without effort. He was wearing the same caliber of clothing as Reg, dark, pressed, precise. The other 2 people at the table Marcus did not recognize. A woman who was introduced briefly as a member of the legal team. A man who was introduced as a member of the investment team. They sat with closed folders in front of them and the neutral expression of people who were there to observe. Reginald Whitfield Sr. looked at Marcus. He said, "Thank you for coming." His voice was exactly what Marcus had expected from the brief time he had spent in the man's presence and had not at the time given sufficient attention. It was low and unhurried, and it assumed, without asserting, that what was said in this voice would be heard. "I want to tell you why you're here," Reginald said. "Not what this meeting is about in the formal sense, but why you, specifically, are here." Marcus said nothing. He had made a decision that morning, sitting in his car outside the building, that whatever happened in this room he would not perform. He had spent years performing the confident regional VP, the good-time friend, the provider, the man in control of his household. He was too tired for it and too exposed for it, and he understood, sitting across from Reginald Whitfield Sr., that the performance had never worked the way he thought it had anyway. "My daughter," Reginald said, "is the most important thing in my life. She and her brother. Everything you see in this building, everything that has my name on it, exists because it was built for them, and it will be passed to them, and my job in relation to it has always been to make sure they have what they need to carry it forward." He paused. "I want you to understand that when I say she is the most important thing in my life, I mean it in the specific sense that this organization, its resources, its capabilities, its relationships exists in service of her and her brother's future. All of it." Marcus listened. "My daughter chose to build a life outside of this," Reginald continued, "on her terms. She chose a man, a marriage, a home, a version of herself that had nothing to do with what you see in this room. I supported that choice because she is my daughter, and she is a woman of extraordinary intelligence and judgment, and her choices are hers to make. He paused. What happened at your son's birthday party has changed the parameters of my involvement. The room was very quiet. I'm not here to threaten you, Reginald said. I want to be very clear about that. This meeting is informational. I want you to have the full picture because I think you have been operating without it, and because I believe you are a man who, given the full picture, is capable of behaving accordingly. He nodded to the woman from the legal team. She opened her folder. What followed was 45 minutes that Marcus Coleman would spend the rest of his life processing in pieces, pulling up like objects from a dark water, some of it the financial architecture of the Whitfield family's holdings, laid out not to impress but to contextualize, some of it the documentation his wife had assembled regarding the marriage, thorough and fair and devastating in its thoroughness, some of it the information about Vanessa Price and her connection to Caldwell Group, which landed in Marcus's chest like a stone and sat there, heavy and specific, the confirmation of what he had started to understand in the parking garage 3 weeks ago, now made complete. He did not perform. He sat and he listened, and when they were done, he sat for a long moment in the silence before speaking. Vanessa was working for them, he said. Not a question. We believe so, Reg said. She was trying to get information about my wife's family through me. That's our assessment, Reg said. We don't believe you were aware of this. Marcus looked at the table. He looked at the photograph of Birmingham on the wall visible through the glass of the conference room. He thought about standing on the sidewalk outside this building, looking up at it, and the particular feeling of a floor dropping away. What do you need from me, he said. Reginald Sr. looked at him. Engage with the divorce process in good faith, he said. Be a present father to Jordan. Sign what needs to be signed without making it harder than it needs to be. He paused. And understand clearly that you were given something extraordinary, and that the failure of it belongs to you. Marcus sat with this. It was, he would think later, the truest thing anyone had said to him in years. Yes, he said. I understand. The call came to Vanessa's cell at 2 p.m. on Friday. She was at her desk. She had been at her desk all morning, doing the controlled version of the thing that people in her position do when they are waiting for a specific outcome, maintaining the appearance of normalcy, performing her regular work, and monitoring every available channel for information. The call was from Harold Caldwell's direct line. She took it in the conference room down the hall, with the door closed. I need you in my office, Harold said now. Harold Caldwell at 71 was a man who had aged precisely silver at his temples, a face that was still sharp, still commanding, the posture of a man who had never needed to take up more room than he needed, because the room had always reorganized itself around him. He had built his company from a single commercial real estate transaction in 1981 and had grown it, steadily and deliberately, into a mid-market private equity firm that did not have the profile of Whitfield Holdings, but operated in similar spaces. He had wanted what Reginald Whitfield had built since the first time he understood what Reginald had built. He looked at Vanessa across his desk. Tell me, he said, how long you've known that Marcus Coleman was married to Simone Whitfield. Vanessa opened her mouth. Don't, he said, don't tell me you didn't know. I need to know when you found out, not whether you knew. A pause. He told me 3 weeks ago, she said. I didn't know before then. Harold looked at her for a long moment. You spent 14 months with a man, he said, and you didn't know his wife's family name. She used his name. She goes by Coleman. She goes by Coleman, Harold said. He said it the way a man says something that confirms what he had privately concluded. You didn't do the work. You were supposed to do the work, he said. That was the entire purpose of the exercise. You were supposed to find out what Coleman's access to the Whitfield family was, what he knew, whether there was anything there we could use. And for 14 months, you apparently accepted the surface version because the surface version was easier. Vanessa was very still. And now, Harold said, Reg Whitfield has just called my general counsel. He has proposed a conversation about certain debt facilities that my general counsel assures me should not be of interest to Whitfield Private Equity, and yet apparently is. He paused. Do you know what that means, Vanessa? She looked at him. It means Simone Whitfield has been doing her own work, Harold said, while you were not doing yours. The silence in the office was the particular silence of something ending. Harold Caldwell looked out the window. He did not look at the Whitfield Holdings building. He looked away from it for the first time in 27 years, which was itself a kind of answer. Clean up your desk, he said, without turning. You'll have a package by end of day. The vehicle was a Delaware LLC formed under a name that had no public connection to anything, and that Simone had chosen, when Reg's paralegal had asked for suggestions, by going through her mother's maiden name syllable by syllable until she found a combination that sounded like a mid-market investment vehicle and meant nothing to anyone who didn't already know. It had been capitalized through a series of transactions that were, individually, unremarkable amounts that moved through accounts and then through other accounts, and ultimately landed in a position that allowed the LLC to acquire, on the secondary market, a meaningful portion of Caldwell Group's outstanding debt at a price that was not a bargain and not a giveaway, simply the price of something that was not being actively sold until a specific and carefully prepared buyer made an offer. The offer had been prepared over 3 weeks. The execution took 4 days. Simone was at her desk at the nonprofit on the Tuesday morning when Reg texted her a single word, "Done." She put her phone face down on the desk and finished the email she was writing to the City Housing Board, which was about affordable housing preservation and had nothing to do with private equity, and was the work she had been doing since before any of this and would be doing after all of it. Then she picked the phone back up and called her father. "It's done," she said. "I know," he said. He was already in his office. "Does Caldwell know?" "His legal team does," her father said. "Harold himself, I imagine, by lunchtime." She sat with that for a moment. "How do you feel?" her father said. She thought about it. She thought about the specific quality of the question, not, "Are you ready?" Not, "Is this what you wanted?" but, "How do you feel?" Her father had always asked the feeling question, which had surprised her as a child, because he was not a man who talked about feelings in the conventional way, and she had come to understand that his interest in her feelings was precisely what a man with his particular capacity for analysis looked like when he loved someone. "Steady," she said. "Good," he said. "I'm not celebrating yet." "No," he said. "But you can." The formal communication from Simone's legal team to Harold Caldwell's general counsel arrived on Wednesday. It was a letter, 3 pages, on the letterhead of Adrian Foster's firm, copying 2 additional firms whose names Harold Caldwell recognized immediately, and that told him everything the letter's text was too polite to say directly. The letter outlined the debt position. It outlined the LLC's rights under the facility agreements. It outlined, in crisp and detailed legal language, what the LLC could and could not do with those rights, and under what conditions the LLC might be inclined to exercise certain of them. It also outlined, in the final half page, the LLC's understanding of certain business development activities undertaken by Caldwell Group employees in relation to members of the Whitfield family, without specifying the mechanism, just the understanding, just the knowing, just the communication that the knowing existed and was documented. The letter did not ask for anything. That was the part Harold found most instructive. A letter that asked for something was a negotiation. A letter that simply laid out what was known and what was held was something else. He sat with it for a long time. Then he called his general counsel and told him to arrange a conversation with Adrian Foster's office. Adrian Foster was 45 years old and had been practicing family law in Atlanta for 17 years, and she had developed, over the course of those 17 years, an ability to recognize when a case was going to be simple and when it was going to be complicated, and to distinguish between these categories early enough to prepare accordingly. Simone Coleman's case had looked, at the initial consultation, like it was going to be straightforward: reasonable assets, reasonable income differential, a child custody arrangement that both parties would likely approach pragmatically, no unusual complexity. What it had actually become was the most layered thing she had handled in years, not in the way of contested divorces, which were complicated in the manner of scar tissue, dense and resistant. This was complicated in the way of something that had been constructed very carefully over a long period of time, and was now being dismantled with equal care. The divorce settlement, which Marcus signed in the first week of November, was not punitive. This was Simone's explicit instruction, and Adrian had followed it not because she was told to, but because she understood the logic of it. A settlement designed to take from Marcus was a settlement designed to keep her connected to him. She was not interested in being connected to Marcus Coleman any longer than the law and their child required. The settlement was fair by any reasonable standard. Marcus kept the house. The accounts were divided according to contribution, which meant, in practice, that Simone recovered substantially more than Marcus, because she had contributed substantially more than he had known, but the division was documented and clean, and there was nothing in it he could go back to a judge with. Jordan would spend alternating weeks with each parent, with flexibility for the parent with Marcus's schedule to accommodate the parent with Simone's schedule, which was a provision that everyone understood meant Simone's schedule took primary consideration without anyone having to say so. Marcus signed. He signed, Adrian told Simone afterward, without a single counter. He read it. He asked 2 questions about Jordan's custody language. She answered them, and he signed. He looked, Adrian said, careful with her words in the way she was always careful, like someone who had already done a full accounting, like a man who had sat down with the ledger and looked at every line and arrived at his own number before he ever saw ours. Simone thought about that. He's not a bad man, she said. He's a careless one. There's a difference. Adrian looked at her for a moment. Not many people in your position can hold that distinction, she said. My father can, Simone said. He taught me. The Caldwell conversation happened on a Thursday in November, in a conference room in Adrian's building, with Reg present and one of Whitfield's transactional attorneys and Harold Caldwell's general counsel, who was a man named Steptoe that Simone had met twice before at events, and who had the look of a man who had been in many difficult rooms and had developed a sustainable relationship with difficulty. Harold Caldwell was not there. Simone had not expected him to be there, and had structured the conversation accordingly. This was not a conversation for principles. This was a conversation for the practical disposition of a set of facts that both sides now held, and the question of what happened next. What happened next was Simone's choice. She had thought about it. She had thought about it in the October evenings in her father's house, with Jordan asleep down the hall and the city quiet outside, in the specific kind of thinking that she did best, slow, patient, without urgency, the way her father had taught her to think about things that mattered. Not what do I want to do to Harold Caldwell, but what outcome serves me, serves my family, serves my son, closes this and does not leave anything open that does not need to be open. The answer was not destruction. The answer was settlement, in the older sense of the word, the sense of something being put down in its proper place and left there. Steptoe and the Whitfield transactional attorney were in that room for 2 hours. They emerged with an agreement, memorandized and signed, that covered the debt position and its disposition, an acknowledgement of certain past business development activities that would remain private but was documented for the record, and a period of non-competition with respect to certain Whitfield Holdings assets that made any future acquisition attempts by Caldwell Group structurally impractical for the foreseeable future. In exchange, the LLC's debt position would be sold back to Caldwell Group at cost, no profit, no penalty. Just the removal of the leverage. Simone had not wanted profit from Harold Caldwell. She had wanted the door locked, and the key turned, and the knowledge on both sides of who had turned it. Steptoe called Harold from the lobby. Whatever Harold said in response to the summary Steptoe gave him, Simone did not hear. She was in the elevator by then, going down with Reg beside her. How do you feel? Reg said. He sounded for a moment exactly like their father. Ready to eat something, she said. I haven't eaten since this morning. He laughed the kind of laugh that came out when the pressure released. She laughed too. They walked out of the building into the November Atlanta afternoon and found somewhere nearby that was warm and had good food, and they sat across from each other and ordered too much and talked about Jordan, and then about their father, and then about their grandmother, and what Meemaw had said when Reg called her on Sunday. She said, Reg reported, and I'm quoting, "Tell Simone," I said, "don't let them write her story for her." Simone nodded. She told me something similar in September. She knows everything, Reg said. Always has, Simone said. Marcus called her on a Sunday in mid-November during Jordan's week with him. It was a regular call. Jordan had wanted to tell her something about a project he'd done at school, and Marcus passed the phone, and then, after Simone had talked to Jordan for 10 minutes, took it back and said briefly, he had a good week. He talked about you a lot. He talks about you a lot, too, she said. A pause. Simone. Marcus said, yeah, I heard what happened. With Caldwell. He said it carefully. I don't know the details, but I heard. Okay, she said, He stopped. He started again. I'm sorry that Vanessa was. I'm sorry that you had to deal with that on top of everything else. She thought about whether she wanted to say anything more than strictly necessary. She had developed, over the past weeks, a relationship with necessary, what was necessary to say, what was necessary to know, what was necessary to hold, and what was necessary to put down. You don't need to apologize for her, she said. She made her own choices. Still, Marcus. She paused. Jordan needs you present. That's what I need from you. Everything else is handled. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I'm working on it. She believed him, which surprised her a little. She believed him because she had heard it in his voice at the meeting, in her father's building, that specific register that she had known for 9 years, and could read as accurately as she had ever read anything. The register that said, I have been found out in something I cannot undo, and I am now doing the accounting. She had never heard that register from Marcus before. She was not sure she would have trusted it before. She trusted it now because she had nothing to lose by trusting it. She was not in this anymore. She was not watching him for signs of what he would do. She simply needed him to be Jordan's father, and she thought quietly, without investment in the outcome that he was going to try. Good, she said. I'll see you Sunday. She hung up. She was sitting on the back porch of her father's house. The November air was cool enough to require a sweater but not cold, the kind of afternoon that Atlanta produced in the fall that always made her think of specific years of school, of her mother, of the texture of things before she had reasons to miss them. The garden was mostly finished for the season. Her father's gardener had put it to bed for the winter, the beds mulched and tidy. She had an apartment she was signing for at the end of the month, her own place in Inman Park, the kind of apartment she could have afforded at any point in her adult life and had not gotten because she'd been in a marriage, and the marriage had had a house. She was looking forward to it with a specific feeling she didn't always have a name for and had started calling hers. The feeling of something that was simply hers. She sat on the porch and let the afternoon be quiet, and she thought about Birmingham. The drive to Birmingham takes 2 hours on I-20, through the flat middle of Alabama, the sky opening up as you get out of the Atlanta sprawl, the landscape going long and brown in November, the particular beauty of a road you have driven so many times it has become part of the rhythm of your life. Simone drove it with Jordan in the back seat, 4 weeks after the divorce was finalized, the first week of December. Jordan was going through a phase of asking questions in the car, not the performative kind that are really declarations, but genuine questions, the kind that 6-year-olds ask when they are working something out and haven't been told yet that certain questions make adults uncomfortable. Mama, he said, somewhere past Aniston. Yeah, baby. Is Granddad rich? She glanced in the rearview mirror. He was looking out the window at the landscape going past, asking the question in the same tone he used for questions about dinosaurs or the solar system. Just trying to understand the world. Yes, she said. Like, a lot rich or a little rich? A lot rich, she said. Is that why we live at his house? We live at his house because he has space and he likes having us there, she said. We're going to have our own place soon. Jordan considered this. Is Daddy rich? Daddy has a good job, she said. He works hard. But not like Granddad. Different kind of rich, she said. There are a lot of different kinds. Jordan seemed to accept this as philosophically satisfying. He went back to the window, then, after a moment, Mama, are we rich? She looked at his face in the rearview mirror. 6 years old. Gap in his front teeth. Marcus's jaw in her eyes, and something that was entirely his own, some particular quality of his attention that she could not trace to either parent, and that she had decided was his own original contribution to the world. Yes, she said. We're rich. Oh, he said. Then I'm glad. Why? He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to everything. Because Meemaw will make the biscuits, he said. Simone laughed. It came out full, unguarded, the kind of laugh that only certain people in her life could produce: her brother, her father, and apparently her 6-year-old son. She laughed for a long moment with the Alabama road going past and the December sky clear and wide above the highway. She will absolutely make the biscuits, she said. Dorothy Whitfield's house was the same house. It had always been a craftsman bungalow on a street in Smithfield that had changed around it over 60 years and left the house itself untouched, not from neglect, but from decision. Dorothy had replanted the front garden 3 times and repainted the porch twice and replaced the roof once and updated the kitchen in the 90s and replaced the kitchen again in the 2010s, and the house was, in consequence, exactly what it looked like: the home of a woman who had been taking care of things for a long time and intended to continue. The smell of biscuits was audible before the door opened. Simone did not know how this was physiologically possible and had decided it was simply a property of her grandmother's kitchen. Jordan burst through the front door with the specific kinetic energy of a child who had been in a car for 2 hours and was now released into a space that smelled like love and carbohydrates. Dorothy caught him before he hit the kitchen table, 91 years old, and she caught him and held him at arm's length and looked at him with the comprehensive attention she gave everything. Let me see you, she said. Jordan stood still, which he did for no one else on earth. You grew, Dorothy said. I'm 6 now, Jordan said. I know you're 6. I was there when your grandfather told me about the day you were born. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she pulled him in and held him against her side, one arm around his shoulders, and looked at Simone over his head. Simone walked to her grandmother. Dorothy released Jordan. Go look in the back bedroom. There's something in there for you. And Jordan was gone at a run. And then it was just the 2 of them in the kitchen, the biscuits on the cooling rack, and the December afternoon coming through the windows. Dorothy looked at Simone's face the way she had been looking at Simone's face for 34 years. You look like yourself, Dorothy said. I feel like myself, Simone said. Good. Dorothy took her hand, both hands, the way she did, wrapping Simone's hands inside her own, which were small and mapped with veins and had made 6 decades of things that mattered. That's the only way I want you to look. Simone stood in her grandmother's kitchen and was, for a moment, nothing but the granddaughter of the woman, not a Whitfield with a legal strategy, not a woman in the middle of a divorce, not the daughter of a trillionaire or the ex-wife of a man who had not known her, not an architect of a corporate reversal. Just Simone in the kitchen, with the biscuits in the December light in her grandmother's hands. "He's going to be okay," Dorothy said. "That boy of yours." "I know," Simone said. "You're going to make sure of it." "I know that, too." Dorothy squeezed her hands once and let go. "Let's feed him," she said, and turned back to the stove. The birthday party happened the following Saturday. Not a do-over, not a replacement. Simone had been careful to explain this to Jordan, who had asked. "We're just having another party," she said, "because you deserve more than one." Jordan had found this reasoning entirely sound. The Whitfield house in Birmingham was the right house for this, not the Atlanta house, which was her father's professional residence, or the Martha's Vineyard property, which was too far, but this house, Dorothy's house, with the backyard that opened up wide in the winter, with the trees bare and the sky all the way to the horizon, and the kitchen that could produce quantities of food that defied reasonable explanation, and the specific gravity of a place that had been holding the family together since before most of the family was born. Regs drove from Atlanta with his wife and their 2 daughters, who were 10 and 7, and treated Jordan with the specific mixture of affection and condescension that older girl cousins bring to younger boy cousins, and that Jordan appeared to find mostly delightful. Simone's father arrived the night before and had spent the morning in the kitchen with Dorothy in the particular companionable silence of a man who had grown up in this kitchen and a woman who had raised him in it. There were cousins from the Birmingham side, Dorothy's niece's children, a set of siblings who ranged from 30 to 50, and who had all known Simone her whole life and treated her accordingly, with the specific warmth of people who did not need to impress each other and were not trying. There was Miss Harriet, who was 94 and Dorothy's oldest friend, and who arrived in the passenger seat of her granddaughter's car, and immediately found a seat at the kitchen table and required nothing further except her coffee and the right to observe, which she did with comprehensive attention. There were no television cameras. There was no formal program. There were no speeches scheduled. There was a table in the backyard with a race car cake, because Jordan had asked, specifically, for another race car cake, and because Simone had driven to the good bakery in Homewood and ordered it, and there were folding tables with food that Dorothy and her daughter-in-law and Reg's wife had been producing since morning, the specific scale of a Whitfield family gathering, enough to feed twice the number of people present and to send everyone home with something. Jordan ran. He ran with his cousins, with Reg's daughters, who condescended to chase him, with 2 neighborhood children who arrived with Dorothy's great-niece and were absorbed into the running without ceremony. He was a child at a party, uncomplicated, burning through the December afternoon with the complete commitment of a person for whom the present moment is the only moment there is. Simone watched him from the porch. Her father came and stood beside her at some point in the middle of the afternoon, with his coat on against the December air and a cup of coffee in his hand, and they stood next to each other the way they had always stood when they were watching something together, her father slightly behind, giving her the sightline, the way he had always done. "He looks good," her father said. "He's happy," she said. "You think he knows? What changed?" "He knows something changed," she said. "He doesn't have the full picture. He will." She paused. "When he's ready. We'll give him the language for it." Her father nodded. They were quiet for a moment. In the yard, Jordan had gotten hold of a ball from somewhere and was attempting to teach Reg's older daughter the rules of a game he appeared to be inventing in real time, with considerable confidence. "I have to ask you something," Simone said. "Ask." "When I called you," she said, "that night, after the party," she looked at him. "What were you going to do if I hadn't had a plan?" Her father was quiet for a moment. "What I did," he said. "Which was what?" "I listened to my daughter," he said, "and then I waited to see what she was going to do." He paused. "And then I helped her do it." "You didn't call Harold?" "No." "You didn't send Reg directly?" "No." He looked at her. "You had been telling me for 7 years that this was your life and your marriage and your choices. I was not going to walk into the last chapter of it and take it from you." He paused. "Even if I wanted to." "Did you want to?" He looked at Jordan in the yard. "Every minute," he said. She put her hand on his arm briefly. Then she dropped it. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her, and his face held what had always held all of it. All 68 years of what it had cost to build what he had built and protect what he had protected and raise 2 children in the world without the armor he would have given them if he could have, and without diminishing them by trying. You didn't need me, he said. You would have done it yourself. Faster with you, she said. He almost smiled. Faster, he allowed. Dorothy's toast happened near the end of the afternoon. As the light was going that particular late December, almost quality of December in Alabama, everything golden and brief, the day closing down around the warmth of the gathered people. She stood at the end of the table and someone handed her a glass sparkling cider because Dorothy had stopped drinking 30 years ago, and she still held glasses at toasts because she believed you had to participate, and she looked around the yard at the assembled Whitfields, which was a complicated and large and specific collection of people, and she said, I'm not going to be long. This was Dorothy at 91. She had long since given up on length. I want to say something about this child, she said, looking at Jordan, who was being held at the table by one of his cousins and who looked, in this moment, exactly like himself, grave with the importance of being toasted, the gap in his teeth visible because he was grinning. This child is 6 years old and he has already survived something that would break a lesser spirit. He doesn't know that. He doesn't need to know it yet, but we know it, and that's why we're here. She paused. I want to say something about his mother, she said. Simone, from her place at the side of the table, did not look at her father. She looked at her grandmother. Some people in this family, not in this yard, but in this family, in the long history of this family going back, before any of you were born, some people had to learn that strength was a thing you showed, Dorothy said. That if you didn't show it, people would think you didn't have it. She paused. And some people had the particular gift of understanding that the strength you don't show is the kind that does the most work. She looked at Simone. Your mother had that gift, she said. I watched her carry things for years without letting anyone see the weight. I told her once that I thought she was too quiet about what she was carrying, and she told me. Dorothy paused, and something moved across her face, something that was not quite grief, not quite pride, but the long compound of both that lives in the bones of people who have loved deeply and lost and kept going. She said, Meemaw, I'm not being quiet about it. I'm just deciding where to put it. The yard was very still. I see her mother in her, Dorothy said. I have always seen her mother in her. She lifted her glass. To Jordan, to Simone, to this family which has survived more than this and will survive whatever comes next, because that's what we do. That's what Edwin built. That's what I protected. That's what your father built, and what your brother is building, and what this woman, she nodded at Simone, is going to build, on her own terms, in her own time, in a way that none of us has fully imagined yet. She paused. Drink, she said. Later, after Jordan had fallen asleep in the back bedroom, in the same bed where Simone had slept as a child, in the same room with the same smell of old wood and cedar and something underneath it that was simply the smell of permanence, Simone sat on the back porch with her father. The night was clear. Alabama December, cold enough now to see breath, the stars out in the specific abundance that Atlanta's light never allowed. They sat in the 2 wooden chairs that had been on this porch since before either of them could accurately remember, and they did not say anything for a long time, because they had reached, between them, the specific comfort of people who had run out of necessary things to say and found what was left was simply each other. Her father had his coffee, cold by now, still holding the cup. She had a blanket. The yard was dark and still. The folding tables collapsed against the house. The dishes done. Reg's family gone back to the hotel on the highway. Dorothy inside in her chair, Miss Harriet long departed. Next year, Simone said. What about it? Jordan's going to want a bigger party, she said. He's going to want all his school friends. We can do that. Here or wherever you want, her father said. She thought about the apartment in Inman Park, her apartment, the one that was just hers, with the morning light she'd checked specifically when she went to look at it, because she had always known that the morning light mattered, and she had not always had a home where it was hers to arrange. She thought about what it would look like when Jordan's things were in it, the particular transformation a child's presence made in a space. She thought about the work she still had to do at the nonprofit, the housing preservation case that had been running for 3 years and was finally in a position to move, the meeting she had on Monday with the city council representative and the advocacy coalition and the developer who had been, until very recently, not particularly willing to be in the same room as the advocacy coalition. She thought about Adrian Foster saying, not many people in your position can hold that distinction. She thought about her mother, who she had been thinking about for weeks, in the particular way of thinking about someone who is not present and cannot be asked things, but whose presence is everywhere in the way you understand yourself. She thought about Dorothy's words, deciding where to put it. She put her head back and looked at the stars. Daddy, she said. Yeah, I'm good, she said. It was not a report. It was not a reassurance. It was the specific statement of a woman who had taken an accounting and arrived at a number and was setting the ledger down. Her father made a sound something between a breath and a response, something that contained, in the compressed way of things he never overspoke, everything he felt about the woman his daughter had become and the particular price and gift of having watched her become it. They sat on the porch. The night was cold and clear. Inside, behind the wall, Jordan slept in the bed where 3 generations of this family had slept, holding the particular unconscious peace of a child who has been fed and celebrated and held by people who loved him, the child who was the bridge between what had been built and what was coming, who carried in his face his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and the gap in his teeth that might close one day and might not, who was 6 years old in December under Alabama stars in a house that had stood since before his mother was born, and who was, in the specific and complete way of a child at the end of a long good day, entirely all right. The porch was quiet. Reginald Whitfield Sr. and his daughter, who was Simone Whitfield, and had always been Simone Whitfield, sat in the 2 wooden chairs and looked at the stars and let the night be what it was. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the precise accounting of everything this family had survived to get here, exactly what enough was supposed to feel like.